Bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good morning, everyone. Today we'll be moving into a new topic. I think I was able to send the handout yesterday night. And because last time we finished the discussion about the conditioned realities, the Sankata Paramattas. So what we have now is to discuss about the unconditioned realities, which are fivefold, according to the Theravāda tradition. Actually, this some teachers may not agree with this sometimes, but we'll discuss on this matter. Say that the unconditioned reality is fivefold, and we normally know about that we aspire to attain. In addition to this nirvana, we find the conditioned states according to this lesson. So if I summarize what we have discussed so far, we first introduce what are the ultimate natures, paramattas. Then they were called paramattas as they have the intrinsic nature of themselves. Out of them, some depend on other realities to their existence, for their existence, and then some do not. So the realities that need the support of other realities for their existence, for the sustaining or to remain, I would call to exist, are called conditioned realities. Realities that do not need such a support, such an assistance, were called unconditioned realities. So in Pali term, we use the conditioned is sankata. Sankata, it's very useful to know these Pali terms. Then the unconditioned is called asankata. A comes for the negative aspect. Sankata is conditioned, asankata is unconditioned. Then we categorize the conditioned realities into four groups. The Paramatta Dhammas, natures, when we discuss about the conditioned realities in terms of arising, we call them the Paramatta Dhammas. Then we discuss about another three stages of these conditioned realities, which were named as Upadano Dhamma, the resultant realities that are supposed to happen as their karma has gained the opportunity. Then Paramatta Jatikas, like potencies that are following our mind stream. Then the Anupanna Dhamma, the non-arisen realities. So these were the topics that we discovered. Non-arisen Dhammas means, Anupanna Dhammas means the realities that are supposed to happen, with which we are bound because the conditions are still prevailing. And then in last week, 2 weeks, we discussed about an analysis about these all four conditioned realities. And we came up with the terms like Paramatta, the Sankata Jatika, and Tekalika Jatika. If you remember the last week's lecture. So now we move into a completely different realm of the realities, which are the unconditioned states. Unconditioned. These realities are not conditioned or not supported by other realities for their existence. When we use the word term Sankata in Pali, the word Sankata, today's topic is called Asankata Paramatta. You remember in the chart, it was here, AP Asankata Paramatta. This was Sankata Paramatta. So we discussed about all these four. Now we are focusing on these five today, right? The Asankata. So when we talk about the word Sankata, it's better to have a small discussion on this. Sankata Sankata can be explained in two ways. Sankata can be explained in two ways. One is based on the Sankata Lakkana Sutta, which is found in Anguttara Nikaya. According to Sankata Lakkana Sutta, any reality that has the three characteristics of conditioned realities. It means if any reality has the natures of arising, nature of decaying, nature of vanishing, Upada, Jati, Jara, Marana, arising, decaying, and vanishing, are called Sankata. At the same time, these realities which undergo these three phenomena have the three stages of existence: Upada, arising; Titi, persisting; Bhanga, vanishing. So remember, we discussed about six qualities, that the arising, decaying, and passing away. Then arising, persisting stage. It's a stage actually. Decaying and persisting are two different things, and passing away. Based on that, we classified realities into past, present, and future. Yes. Sorry for the interruption. The technical team has something to check. Yeah. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
If a reality to be called Sankata, there are two ways to call something a Sankata. Sankata we normally translate in English as conditioned, made out of causes, produced by causes. It means that need the support of causes. So one way of interpreting this is the realities that have the three characteristics, which were called Upada, Titi, Jati, Jara, Marana, arising, decaying, and vanishing, and which undergo the three phases of existence, that is arising, persisting, and vanishing, are called Sankata, are called conditioned realities. That was the first way of interpreting. So based on these six characteristics, we would term times. The reality which has arisen and passed away is past. The reality which has arisen but not vanished yet is called present. And a reality that has not arisen yet is called future. So based on these conditioned natures, we can classify realities based into time, realities related to time. Then another way of defining the Sankata is realities that need the support of other realities. Reality that need the support of other realities to their existence. Realities that need the support of other realities to their existence. That is another definition of Sankata. Another definition of Sankata. So in the same way, when we come into Asankata, so if I write there, Sankata, the realities that have or possess, we can call the three characteristics of we call then of condition, of the condition, right? The condition, that is rising, decaying, and vanishing. If something has these three characteristics, we can call it a Sankata. Another way of defining Sankata, this is based on Sankata Lakkana Sutta. Another way of defining the word Sankata is realities that need, that require the support or assistance of other realities to their existence. The second way of defining. So this definition comes based on the we can arrive at this definition based on the word formation. Is it a new definition? No, this is fully fully in line with the Buddha's teachings. The sutra, we normally say this was like sang, the plus kra, the Sanskrit root kata, right? We know the V changes into R, and then because of sans, the root S and K change into KKH, and then because of triple consonants, because of three triple consonants, become Sankata, and this Niketa change into this, that is grammatically becomes the word Sankata. Right? So this Kri, the Sanskrit word, is normally in Pali we call it Kar, to make, to do something. So the realities which are Sang means having come together, Sangs, having come together, having some come together. Ta indicates the past participle, the passive past participle. Something which was done, that is called kata. Something which was done. Done by whom? Done by other realities having come together. Having come together. Samagantva, having come together. The realities which were done by other realities having come together are called Sankata. So that is how we make the word. So, and this, if any reality is depending on other realities, it has an arising, it has an persisting, decaying, and it also vanishes one day. So therefore, we have two ways of explaining about the word Sankata. So when we talk about the Sankata Lakkhana Sutta, we focus on this aspect. And when we talk about the necessity of causes for a reality to happen or to some reality to exist, to sustain, then we go into the second definition. So the realities that we have so far discussed have both the characteristics. They do possess these three characteristics, and they do need the support of other realities for their existence. They were the Paramatta Dhammas. Directly we call Sankata. And the remaining three, the last three, the Upadino, Paramatta Jatika, and Anupannas, also are related to these aspects. For instance, we discussed how they are related to arising and decaying and passing away, because they are the realities that would arise and pass away in future. So they were, even though they were not pure Sankatas, they are related to Sankata. We call them Sankata Jatika. We call them Sankata Jatika. Then with regard to the second aspect, we can understand the karma remains fertile, capable of giving a rebirth as long as avijja and tanha remain. So likewise, they also need some support of other realities. So in that sense, those natures also can be called Sankata in this regard. So now what we are talking about Asankata. Asankata means completely negative of these aspects. So Asankata realities does not have the natures of arising, decaying, and vanishing. And also they do not need the support of other realities for their existence. I'll repeat what I said again. Asankata realities does not have these characteristics of arising, decaying, and vanishing. And at the same time, they do not need the support of other realities to their existence. So that's why they are called Asankata, completely opposite, completely different from conditioned reality. So we call them the unconditioned reality. The unconditioned reality. So now we are going to discuss about how do we understand this unconditioned nature. So we normally say, if this unconditioned reality doesn't have arising, doesn't have decaying, and doesn't have the vanishing, if it doesn't undergo the three stages of arising, persisting, and passing away, it cannot be distinguished, it cannot be classified either as past, present, or future. Because something which has arisen and passed away is called past. Something which has arisen but not vanished yet is called present. Something which has not arisen yet is called future. So if some reality doesn't have these characteristics of arising, especially the arising characteristic, we cannot classify it into the time, within the time frame. So we call they are kala muttaka, freed from time. Unconditioned states should not be distinguished as past, present, or future. But do they exist? Yes, they do exist. They do not undergo the phases of arising, persisting, and passing away. Upada, Titi, Banga. They do not go under these three phases. But do they arise? Do they exist? Yes, they exist. So now the contradiction may occur in someone's mind. What about this Titi phase? Titi is persisting, right? So when we say unconditioned reality doesn't have an arising, doesn't have an passing away, doesn't it exist? Does it exist? Yes, it does exist. So can't we call that it is persisting according to that? No. The reason is, according to the Theravadins, the phrase or the term persisting has a specific unique meaning. Persisting means, Titi means, the existence between, the phase of existence between arising and vanishing. The Titi or the persisting means the phase between arising and vanishing. So that is the explanation of Titi. Another way is, after it has arisen till passing away, the decay, the stage in which the decay was seen. Whatever way may we may use, but persisting always refers to a stage between arising and vanishing. So if a reality doesn't have an arising, doesn't have an passing away, though it exists, even though it exists, it should not be designated or coined as this Titi, as a Titi. So therefore, the unconditioned realities, even though they do not have a phase of Titi, why do we don't call it a Titi? They are existing, their existence, because they don't have a rising and passing away. It's just a matter of terming them, matter of naming them. So unconditioned realities do exist, because during the phase of Titi, according to Buddha's teachings, during the phase of Titi, alternation is seen, the decaying is seen. So another characteristic of Titi is, during that phase of persisting, the reality decays. That's how we understand about it. Should understand about the Titi. So now these unconditioned states, if they didn't have an arising, they doesn't have a vanishing, what does it imply? It means they have been existing forever. They have been existing forever, and they will exist forever. They have been existing forever, and they will exist forever. It seems very odd when we look into this with an ordinary mind, with normal mindset, ordinary. Think about it. Can something exist forever? Because even that was the argument of Thomas Aquinas when he was going to advocate the existence of God. But it is improbable or impossible, and it's not logical that something have an existence forever, which had been existing forever. Same thing applies to samsara when we come into Buddhism. So, but according to Theravada teachings, the samsara doesn't have a beginning, and because if it has a beginning, we come into the Buddhism. Actually, the entire teachings of the Buddhism collapse. If we have a beginning, we come into huge contradictions what the Buddha has taught. So, based on Theravada aspect, Buddhism exists. The beginning of the samsara cannot happen. If you look into the matter in terms of the Theravada perspective. I'm not saying that what the other arguments made by others are invalid. When we look into the matter in terms of Theravada Buddhism, the beginning cannot happen. So we'll come into that discussion in another lecture. So how it is related to our meditation and how it is related to the understanding of Buddhism. So according to this explanation, the unconditioned states had never had a beginning. So it means they have been existing forever. And they will never have vanishing. They will never experience the vanishing. So it means they will exist forever. So this idea of ever is something very, very strange. And another infinite idea within the Theravadins is the limitation of the space. According to the Theravadins, the space doesn't have a limit. How much you travel in this universe, you'll still have some part, still have more to travel. And that the number of the beings within the universe. These are things that the Theravadians put into like we are unable to explain it logically or give a explanation that fits to the ordinary mind. But when you come into the stage of Kanka Vitarani, the getting rid of the doubt, we normally get rid of the doubt about a beginning, that he comes into the conclusion that he cannot has a beginning. And that's the main thing, that within the samsara cannot have beginning when someone comes into the stage of Kanka Vitarani, having contemplated on the cause and effect relationship. Anyway, because if to finalize this statement, because if the samsara had a beginning, how do we explain the first nama and rupa? What were the causes for this nama and rupa? And what was the existence if one was born into? Is the first life is a human life, or first life is a divine life, or a Peta life, or an animal life? Then which phenomena decided this arising? So then, if the first existence could happen without a karma, because if there was no karma, so it means if someone was born as a human being, it shows that even without a wholesome deed, someone can be born as a human being spontaneously without any cause. If someone was born in the first life in the woeful realms, it shows that without akusala karmas, you can be born in the woeful realms, and that contradicts with the theory of karma. And then, the most importantly, so we know that attainment of nirvana, attainment of the full liberation or cessation happens when we remove the causes for rebirth. We come into the full liberation. That will be the eternal peace. So if we are advocating the first arising, beginning of samsara, how the first arising, first life has without any causes, because there were no causes prior to the first arising, first life. So then the first life has suddenly popped up. So it means without causes, the life can come up. So if that is the case, how do we guarantee that even though after we have eradicated all the causes and become an arahant and enter the parinirvana, how do we guarantee that there will be no, the suffering would not start again? Because in the first place, occurred without a cause. If the Theravadians advocate the beginning of samsara. So that's why I said the entire Theravada Buddhism collapses if you are advocating a beginning of samsara. It's not something that is not taught. It's not something that we should not think about. It is something that is clearly advocated within the teachings, and also something that matches the teachings. So then we come into the topic, the unconditioned reality has existed forever and will exist forever. So how do we understand this nature? How do we understand that existing, or the nature of this unconditioned state? I would use the word states, the plural I have used in the handout, because we are going to explain about 5 unconditioned states. In the end, I will reduce them into 4 actually. So then, so I will start from the last one, the nirvana, nissarana nirvana. That is the nirvana that we aspire, we wish to attain. We can call it the Maha Nirvana, the Great Nibbana, the Great Nibbana. So how do we understand this? And there are 2 ways that we have to understand. We have to look into this unconditioned state. There are 2 ways. One way is explaining it as a reality that do exist. The other way is the cessation or the liberation from the suffering that is going to happen. So these are the 2 approaches. One is that it should be explained as a completely a different state from that is of the suffering. If my memory was correct, in the Alagadupama Sutta, Buddha mentioned there are 2 stages, and the non-existence of the suffering. Dukkhancha, dukkha nirodhancha. He advocates 2 states of it. But it includes all the 4, because in the suffering part, we can have the cause of suffering and also the path to get rid of the suffering. So mainly we have the conditioned side and the unconditioned side. So they are completely two different states or two different existences. And the first way was explained. But if we take this approach, the nirvana or the unconditioned state does not have much benefit of it. It means it will not be a greater bliss as the Buddha has advocated. So therefore, the nirvana should be explained with another approach, that is the non-arising or the cessation of the suffering, a cessation of the suffering that was going to happen had the causes prevailed. So we'll come into that matter now. So we'll first we'll think about the first approach. According to this, there are two stages. For instance, if you take this board as the unconditioned state, for an analogy or simile, the board as the unconditioned state, it exists regardless of the suffering. How does it exist? What is the logic behind it? We cannot explain it. Why such a state exists? We cannot explain that logically. So then, first thing is, how do we believe on it? Because based on the faith, what the Buddha and his disciples have said, so such a state exists. So can't it logically be assumed? Yes, it could be, it can be. That is what the Sumedha, the Bodhisattva, before his first prophecy, thought or assumed that there should be such a state opposite to the suffering, like the light against the darkness, or the healthiness against the sickness. So it can be assumed by some special beings if you think wisely. And also these all the validity of this unconditioned state remains that on the fact that there is a rebirth, there is a suffering which is going to continue. If you think about end of a suffering at the end of the death, these kind of teachings are not necessary, because Buddhism depends on the rebirth. If there is no rebirth, there is no use of such a teaching, because the suffering is going to end at our death, right? So therefore, now if you take this as the unconditioned state, this is the unconditioned state. The suffering we experience in the nama and rupa. So we'll go to our famous diagram. So this is the birth, and this is the death. This is the future, this is the past, and this is the present life. Then someone is born, the nama rupa exists. So now we are here, and there will be some other nama rupa which is going to happen, and it is followed by karma. Karma is supported by avijja and tanha, supported. So as long as the tanha karma is supported by these, one day it will get the opportunity. So I'll wait from here. One day it will get the opportunity. And then it will produce some results. Anupanna realities. But last week's lecture I mentioned Anupanna reality are just potential. These are the future realities. We normally say these are the future realities. Anupanna realities, that the boundness, the potency that we possess at the moment. The potency that we possess at the moment. But for the easiness of explanation, now I'll go back to the older diagram. So I will call them the Anupanna realities rather than the future realities. But if you remember in the previous lecture, I changed the diagram and mentioned Anupanna should be addressed, and also Upalina should be addressed from here, not from here, because this is the position of the future realities. But since it doesn't make, it is very difficult to convey the idea of this Anupanna realities at this point, so I'll again come into the older diagram and say that these are the Anupanna realities, the suffering that is going to, the suffering we are bound with, right? So now I'll just change this a bit. I'll make it, this is the present one. We can mention the karma is following us, and from future we will get the opportunity. Now this is the future aspect. The past, we have lived and died, and in the past life karma was supported by avidya and tanha in the previous life. So he got the opportunity and gave a return. Gained the opportunity one. Right. So this is the normal diagram we drew. So now if we go into the anupanna, now the aspects, like these are the paramata dhammas, the reality that arise and pass away. These are the latent forces, the paramata jatikas. Just we leave apart the upadino dhammas. Upadino dhammas we always discuss after the karma has gained the opportunity, the resultants that are going to happen. So we'll just leave it apart. So these are the paramata jatikas, and these are the anupanna dhammas that are going to happen as long as the conditions prevail. Conditions prevail. As long as the conditions prevail. So now there was the unconditioned state. There was the unconditioned state, and there is this conditioned existence. Conditioned existence. So in the first approach, I mentioned the nirvana or the unconditioned. I'm talking about the great nirvana here today. Great nirvana. So we'll move into the other types of nirvanas next week. The great nirvana do exist regardless of the existence of these states. It do exist. So how do we prove this within the tradition? Because the Buddha has mentioned such a state does exist. Such a state does exist. If such a state is not existing, it is impossible to have a liberation from this suffering. So that was his utterance. That was his one of his lion's roars that he's mentioning, that there is such a state which is unconditioned, which is unmade, which is unconstructed, which doesn't have a decay, in which there is no birth, no death, and so forth. There are such number of few suttas Buddha has mentioned about the existence of this state. So the tradition explains, the later books explain that if someone asks a question, how could such a state exist? Because while all what we experience is conditioned realities and also the forces, how do we advocate the logic behind such an unconditioned state? How such thing happens? So it's very difficult to explain looking into these conditioned states. So that is the first way of approaching nirvana. So it's an unconditioned state. So that is the first approach. It exists. The second approach is, I'll later at the end of the lecture, I'll combine these two approaches and try to understand this existence of this unconditioned state based on the Buddha's teaching. Now, according to another second approach is the non-arising of the unarisen suffering. The non-arising or cessation of the suffering that is about to happen, that is supposed to happen, had the conditions prevail. Some of these suffering would occur. So what we are doing is we remove the conditions. So we get free from the suffering. So if we draw it in the diagram, so if the avidya and tanha are removed, karma becomes infertile. We can call it was exhausted. So at that time, if this is the occasion where the arahanthood happens, the eradication happens. If this were the eradicating chitta, by which the causes were removed, then what happens? With the removal of the causes, the suffering that was supposed to happen becomes ceased before its arising. So the suffering is seized. The suffering that was supposed to happen. See, this suffering that is supposed to happen cannot be removed. That's why Arahant has to live after his attainment. So this is the cessation of the suffering that was going to happen. I think we discussed on this matter a few times. And at the same time, it is a liberation, because you get liberated from the suffering that is going to happen. Liberation always comes from something which is about to happen, not from something that has occurred. According to the Theravāda teachings, something happens, as a suffering occurs to us, it naturally passes away momentarily. Another new suffering occurs. It's a momentary existence is happening. In such a momentary doctrine, a doctrine which advocates about the momentariness, If something has occurred, it will naturally vanish. There is no need of escape, no need of a liberation, because naturally that suffering will cease. So liberation is always related to the related to the escape from something which has not come yet, the suffering that we haven't confronted yet. From that, we are advocating a liberation. So therefore, this can be called as a liberation because we got liberated from this moment. At this moment, we get liberated. But the moment we attain arahanthood, we get liberated from suffering. The moment we get the arahanthood, the non-arisen suffering, the anupanna dukkha, would cease. Anupanna dukkha. Anupanna dhammas would cease. This is paramata jatikas, right? The paramata dhamma. Right? I also mentioned, instead of calling them future, I gave the position for the anupanna dhammas, for the easiness of understanding. So when these paramata jatikas were put down, this anupanna dhamma comes into cessation. So that is called the liberation. That is called the nirvana, the cessation. Because the suffering got ceased, we call it nibbana. Because of the cessation, we call it nibbana, nirvana. We got liberated, liberation. We call vimutti. Another word, vimutti, liberated from the suffering. Cessation of the suffering. What kind of cessation? It's not the momentary cessation. In reality, the suffering which occurred, the mind and matter, ceased naturally, passes away naturally. We are not talking about this naturally passing away. We're talking about a cessation before the arising. And that is a liberation. And then we can also call it was eradicated in one way, or exhausted, got exhausted, eradicated, or got exhausted. So we call it pahana sometimes. What was exhausted? What was eradicated? The non-arisen suffering. And also, that was the eradication or removal, or all these cessations, eradications, liberations are off. We can say are off, cessation off, eradication off, and liberation from the non-arisen suffering. Non-arisen suffering. You know that, right? So these three aspects, the cessation, liberation, and eradication. What was the cessation of what? Cessation of the non-arisen suffering. Liberation from what? From non-arisen suffering. Eradication or exhaustion of what? Of the non-arisen suffering. So we call it in Pali anupada. Anupada nirodha. One word. Anupada nirodha. I have given in the handout these three terms. So the same nirvana we can term as the nirvana because it was the cessation of the suffering, ceasing of the suffering. It is the liberation from the suffering. It is the eradication or the exhaustion of suffering. And also these cessations, eradications, liberations are from the non-arisen suffering. So therefore, we give the terms nirvana, vimutti, pahana, anupanna nirodha, or anupada nirodha, whatever term we use. So these are synonyms of nirvana. We can find these terms. Sometimes the word pahana can have few meanings. We'll discuss them in a future lecture if we happen to continue. Pahana has few meanings. Sometimes it refers to this nirvana state, this sarana pahana. We have these terms. So this is the second approach. Freedom or cessation of the non-arisen suffering. The first approach, nirvana do exist. It has been existing. It will exist forever. It's a completely different state from the conditioned realities. Just acceptance. We have to accept that. When we are studying, accept means when we are studying, we have to take it as a reality that exists based on the Buddha's teachings. Now, why do we need such two approaches? That is also very necessary to understand. Why do we need two approaches? Now I'll go into the second approach. The second approach, cessation of the non-arisen suffering, liberation from the non-arisen suffering, eradication of the non-arisen suffering. So if we term nirvana in this way, a very logical and obvious question is, does nirvana depends on suffering? Someone can ask the question, if the suffering didn't exist, nirvana cannot exist, because nirvana itself is the cessation of the suffering. So cessation of the suffering depends on suffering. If there is no suffering, there cannot be. If there was no suffering, you cannot have a liberation from that suffering. If there was no suffering, there cannot be an eradication or exhaustion of suffering. So therefore, if we take only the second approach, the question we encounter is that nirvana depends on suffering. If there is no suffering, there cannot be a nirvana. This contradicts with the teachings. Therefore, only the second approach has few questions, unanswerable questions. Then what we think about the first approach? We talk about the first approach. Now think. This is also one common, can be a common way of thinking about Nirvana. Nirvana exists as a separate state. Now we think in meditation. Now we'll think about a practical aspect. When we meditate, do vipassana meditation. When the wisdom comes into a higher stage, the yogavachara, the yogi, the meditator observes nirvana suddenly. That is not happening spontaneously, it's happening with a gradual training. His mind has to be escalated to that level in order to observe this unconditioned blissful object. So what do we think? If this was the Maggachitta, now assume, we'll try to think about it. If this was the nirvana, if, right? I'm using the word if. Nirvana is a completely different reality from conditioned realities. If it was a complete reality and we do observe it, when we observe the nirvana with the Maggachitta, with the wisdom, it eradicates the kamma and kilesa, and the suffering we get. We know that this suffering exists. We have discussed on this matter. That's why I had to have that approach of Anupanna to explain nirvana.
Hi, Bhante, are you still there?
What we are talking about now, the defects of the second approach, I think we discussed. Now, the first approach, if we make the first approach, nirvana is if we consider nirvana as an existing state, apart from the unconditioned states, apart from the conditioned states. So now we normally know when we meditate and we attain the arahanthood, at that moment, the part consciousness observes nirvana. We start to see this nirvana when our wisdom has got developed to that particular level. With that observation, together with that observation, with the wisdom that we have developed so far, this part consciousness eradicates the causes of suffering. So when the causes are eradicated, this suffering that we are bound to experience would be ceased. We know that. That's why we normally say, why do we, as Buddhists, why do we say that please attain the nirvana? Why do we make efforts to attain nirvana? Because it is going to come countless times as we wander in the samsara. We know that to get rid of this suffering, we are trying to attain the nirvana, to observe nirvana or to see nirvana. That is the normal idea of common Buddhists. Now, if we think bit sharply, or if we scrutinize this idea, what do we think? What do we think? Now, this path consciousness observes nirvana, which is a completely different state, different reality, and then eradicate the cause, and we get rid of the suffering. The suffering is no more in that sense. He says suffering is no more. Right? Suffering is no more. So now what do we think? What is the real bliss? What is the greatest bliss? Is it the nirvana or the non-existence of the suffering? What would be we would aspire to? What would be the greatest bliss that we are going to experience, or what we are going to desire? Is it the nirvana which became the object of the path consciousness, which helped to eradicate the causes, or the non-existence of the suffering itself? The obvious answer is that is the liberation, that is the cessation, that is what we want. In this case, if we take this first approach, nirvana is just a means by which we attain the highest bliss. The highest bliss. Highest bliss should be the absence of the suffering. Highest bliss should be the cessation of the suffering. Highest bliss should be the liberation from the suffering. But how the Buddha has mentioned there is no bliss higher than nirvana. If this first approach was made, only the first approach was made with such an attitude, Buddha had to say nirvana is the instrument or the cause which supports you to attain the greatest bliss, which is the liberation from the suffering that is going to happen. So therefore, with the first approach, nirvana is not the greatest bliss. And it is not the refuge of being. The refuge being, in this case, the refuge is the non-existence of the suffering. But that is not how the Buddha has mentioned. So if you want to match the explanations with the Buddha's teachings, we cannot take only the first approach. Why is that? The suffering, we were bound with the suffering, and that release from that suffering should be bliss. Should be the greatest bliss. So how do we get rid of these two contradicting or two opposing ideas? If we take the second approach, if you only take the second approach, saying that the nirvana is the cessation of the suffering, liberation from the suffering, eradication of the suffering which has not arisen yet, then what happens? Nirvana becomes something depending on suffering. Without suffering, there cannot be nirvana. This also shows a huge defect in the explanation. If we take nirvana as a completely separate than this process, completely apart from reality, something like a new, something like a chitta or chetasika which exists. We observe it and we get rid of the suffering. Then nirvana is not the highest bliss. So how do we get rid of that? We have to combine both the approaches. For the basic, the very fundamental aspect of this merging is we have to take, there are only two aspects exist. I'm talking about the animated beings, the living beings. This is not applicable to non-living things. With regard to living beings, only there are two phases, or better not to say phases, two aspects, two states. The state of the conditioned, existing of the conditioned reality, the continuation of the conditioned reality. So when we say the samsara, we have to take the past, the present, and also the future that is going to come. This is the conditioned state. Then we have an unconditioned state according to the first approach. It exists regardless of the first conditioned state. So what happened? There is no third stage. There is no third aspect. Only two exist. So that's why in the first lecture I mentioned. So we have to take it as two things. This is nirvana and this is the conditioned state. So what happens? So if we consider up to here is the past and the present, this is going to be the future lives. So when the causes are eradicated, when the causes are eradicated, the suffering that is about to happen would cease. So what remains is the other state. That is the nirvana. There's no third stage. If we take only the first approach, sometimes, not always, sometimes we may come into an idea about a nirvana, the existence of the conditioned state, and the non-existence of the condition. So that the third thing is we are abolishing that third stage and saying only two stages exist. So what happens? So the non-existence of this suffering itself is the nirvana. Why is that? Because there is only two stages. There's the stage of the existing conditioned realities and the unconditioned reality. So what happens when these conditioned realities come into the cessation? So what comes up is the nirvana. See another simile. This table is covered with a cloth. When you remove the cloth, what comes up is the table. So likewise, when we want to merge, like when we want to apply the teachings based on the Buddha's explanations. So the cessation of the suffering, the liberation of suffering, eradication of suffering itself is the nirvana, and that is the second stage. If there are only two stages, the absence of suffering, the cessation of suffering is the nirvana itself. And it has been existing forever. Why is that? Because it's a completely different stage. It's a completely different state. It was covered to us by this conditioned state. Us means this conditioned state covers it. So when the condition, the non-arisen conditioned realities, not the arisen ones, non-arisen conditioned realities comes into cessation. Now we say the nirvana is like the board of this approach because it has problems. So nirvana we consider as the board. So when the causes are removed, when the non-arisen suffering is taken out, what happens? What remains is the board. That is the nirvana. And that is the real bliss. Yes, the non-existence of the suffering itself is nirvana. The cessation of the suffering itself is nirvana. That's it. So now finally, I'll take 5 more minutes to come into this one. Now, in terms, this is the explanation in terms of the ultimate sense. Now we come into the conventional idea. Conventionally, how do we explain nirvana? Anupanna Dhamma, right? Conventionally, how do we explain nirvana? Right. So before that, did this state exist forever? Yes, it existed. So that's why at this moment, even at this moment, we have the possibility. If the karma and kilesa were eradicated, this suffering would not have occurred. We would have attained nirvana. So therefore, it exists forever. It exists even at this moment. It's a matter of fact that we don't remove the causes and get liberated from the suffering. So now, conventionally, how do we explain Nibbana? Now, in this approach, it's just the Chitta and Chetasika process is there, Nirvana state was there. So there was no being who attained Nirvana. It's only the non-arisen aggregates, non-self, non-arisen aggregates got seized. So there was no one who attained Nirvana in terms of the ultimate explanation. Because there's no one to attain Nirvana, even at this place. It's just the Nama and Rupa existing. So there's nothing to worry that what would happen to me or what would happen to us if we attain Nirvana, because there was no person in the first place to get seized from the Nirvana. What got seized from the Nirvana are the Nama and Rupa, not the being, not the person. Not the being, not the person. It was the Nama and Rupa which got seized. Now we go into the conventional approach. According to the conventional approach, we say the Buddha attained Nirvana. Arahants attain Nirvana. We want to attain Nirvana, otherwise we are going to face the suffering. So when we bring the conventional approach, Nama and Rupa are called I, are called we, or the being. I will use the word being, the living being. So to which part of Nama and Rupa does this word applies? Is it the past Nama Rupa, present or future? To all. That's why we say, I have been experiencing such suffering in samsara. I am experiencing at the moment and I will experience in the future. So if we are in the conventional explanation, we should not mix it with the ultimate explanation. We cannot say, I exist only at this moment, not in the future, not in the past. Future and past are ultimate realities. Only this moment we get the conventions. No, if the convention teaching, if we approach the conventional approach, the Panyati approach, if we take it as a living being, the entire process of Nama and Rupa should be taken as the being, living being. So conventionally, the entire thing is the being. The entire thing, entire process is the being. All Paramatta Dhammas, Anupanna Dhammas, that's why we have a discussion. So when we call a being, we have to include all, even the potencies. Even the potencies. So this is the being, the sphere of the being. Right? You may copy out. You can draw it with another color if you want. This is the being, conventionally. We take this is the living being. Living being. That is a conventional explanation. Taking the aggregates as the living being. So it's not an ultimate explanation. It's a conventional explanation. So if we take the entire thing as the being, what happens? When the causes are removed, this will also be removed. So if this unarisen suffering belongs to the being conventionally, so where the being was before, now there is nirvana. So we attains the nirvana. If the unconditioned non-arisen suffering belongs to the being, this nirvana also should belong to the being conventionally, not ultimately. So if we make the conventional approach, that was our suffering, that's our liberation. I was bound with suffering and I attained liberation, because conventionally I have attained. This is nirvana, because I was labeled to the entire process of the suffering. So if we get rid of this part of the suffering, which is the non-arisen part, then what get manifest, what remains is the nirvana, the non-existence of suffering. So that belongs to me also. So if you make the ultimate approach, there is no person, it's just a Nama and Rupa process. The non-arisen Nama Rupa is continues, bound to continue as long as the causes remain. When the causes are removed, that suffering gets ceased. So there's no one who attained nirvana. Only the non-arisen aggregates were ceased with the removal of the causes. So this is the unconditioned state, and it does exist even at this moment, because think that if this was not attained, we are bound with this suffering. Now, just to conclude the lecture, the final statement. At this level, now if we, as long as Arahanta Magga is not attained, we are bound with this suffering. But if we have the opportunity now to decide or to strive whether we arouse this or not, if we arouse this would be seized. The nirvana will be attained. If we don't arouse this, the suffering will still continue. So the nirvana didn't arise with our attainment. It already existed. It is a matter of entering or attaining it. It's just a matter of fact whether we bring the noble path or arouse the noble path or not. So therefore, even at this level, we have the two options. If we continue as it is, we would end up in the suffering. If you arouse the path consciousness and remove the causes, you would end up in nirvana. So even at this moment, we have the both possibilities, and it is a possibility that we could attain. And it is not just the absence of suffering. It's not this empty space. It has a glory. It is such a wonderful object. By seeing it, by observing it, the path consciousness could eradicate the nirvana. When someone observes nirvana for the first time after go through Buchitta, surely he's going to eradicate nirvana. So that is the glory of nirvana, which also indicates it's not just a mere empty space. It is the emptiness. We can call it an emptiness, absence of the suffering that is going to happen. So therefore, and the first approach is it does exist as a completely separate state. what is the logic behind it is very difficult to explain. So therefore, in order to explain the unconditioned state, the last nirvana, the Mahanirvana, we have to have two approaches. So then this state is unconditioned, it has been existing forever, and it is also the liberation, cessation, eradication of the non-arisen suffering. Yeah, this would be the lecture for today, and yeah, I took some time as more time as I was supposed to. So I'll open the forum for the Q&A session.
Okay, thank you, Bhante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So I'm sorry, but I'm gonna call out to Mr. Ananda, because I remember last time you had a lot of questions. Would you like to ask questions now? We can give you priority. Hello, Mr. Ananda. Okay, so maybe he's not at the, oh yeah, he's here.
There was an hand.
Okay, so it was muted. I'm sorry. Thank you so much, Ryan and Bhante. Actually, the last time question I don't remember. I think it is. It's not really, I think, important. But anyway, so you were mentioning about asanya satta. So it just came to my mind. Like, if you want to get an kind of understanding about it, is it a situation like when a person is brain dead? Or in a coma? So during that time, I mean, he's living, but he has no any senses working. So is it something like still the person is existing, the person is living but no senses? So I don't know whether it's kind of a situation like that. Is that?
Yeah, there's no consciousness, and it's quite different because when person is unconscious, still at least the bhavanga chitta will continue. So asanya chitta, there's no such chitta. So what is the bliss? What is the benefit of this? I will be discussing exactly in the next lecture. So we can have a good discussion after we have the explanation about the other stages of nirvana. So I'll be directly pointing about the asanya chitta question. Next week we can have a broader discussion after we.
Okay. That's another question. I don't know whether I can ask this question now. When you say asankata, now you say asankata is existing.
Yeah.
So it has to exist compared to a living being, right, Bhante? Like now, if you understand it as non-existence of samsara or samskara, or namarupa, so that is what is called existing, right? Non-existence of namarupa. Is that right?
That's right. That is a second approach. So if we come into only with the second approach, your question is inevitable. Because if it is a non-arisen of suffering, it depends on the being, it depends on the suffering. That's why I say if you only take a second approach, you come into a unexplainable thing that how can it be unconditioned. That's why the first approach is necessary. It does exist independent of the suffering, and that state is equal to the non-existence of suffering. So what I've done is, what we do is we merge the two approaches. So nirvana is a completely different state of conditioned reality. But when the suffering becomes ceased, what remains, what has is nirvana. So we say the suffering got ceased in nirvana. So the non-existence of suffering itself is nirvana. So that is by merging these two approaches. Otherwise, if we take only it is the cessation of suffering, as you said, we come into a problem that how can it be unconditioned? Yeah.
Thank you, Bhante. Yeah. Understood. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bhante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And then again, hi, Bhante. So I'm still having some problem accepting, I could say, accepting the second approach. Because so we have the very similar situation for the akinchanya yatana chitta, right? Because akinchanya yatana chitta, it takes the absence of the first chitta, the rupa chitta. And we know that the absence of that, we define it as the paññatti. So here it looks to me they are very similar definition here, because it's also the absent or the cessation of the non-arising suffering. So that by itself is some kind of a paññatti to me.
Yeah. So it can be explained as a paññatti. There are places where it has been explained, like especially in Maggavihārī. This non-cessation of the non-arisen, cessation of the non-arisen. If we take the mere absence, it's considered as a paññatti. It has to be a paññatti for sure. So here, what happens is, why do we call it the nirvana? Because of the first approach, because it exists. So when this becomes non-existing, so what we have is the nirvana. So we identify that this non-existent is the nirvana itself. But if you avoid this idea, like if you remove this idea of nirvana and just focus non-existence of the suffering itself, then it is a paññatti. It's a paññatti. You are correct. So what we are doing here is, we are saying that there is no three stages. So in the ultimate approach, when the cessation is happening, what we have is nirvana. So then we are equalizing this non-existent with nirvana, and we explain that the non-existent is the nirvana itself. That is called appavatti. So now what is the difference of panya akinchanya? So now that non-existent comes after it has passed away. Now from here, we know it's non-existing. Even though it's non-existing, the sankharas do exist again and again. So it's not a manifest. The Nibbana was not manifested here. The only difference is, when this word come into the non-existence, Nibbana became prominent or became evident. It came up. It is what is left. So therefore, in that regard, we are going to equalize these two. Because the reason is, according to the Buddha, nirvana is the greatest bliss. Nirvana is the greatest bliss. Otherwise, what happens? If nirvana is something else, and this absence is just a mere paññatti. And if it is not nirvana, the real bliss becomes the non-existence of the suffering. So that is not how the Buddha has mentioned. Buddha has called it as the ultimate bliss. So what we are doing, your question is very sharp and it's to the point. If you only consider about the non-existence of the suffering, regardless of the nirvana state, yes, it's a paññatti. So if someone calls that is nirvana, it has been rejected within the sasana. You can see this argument in Abhidhamma. And also some other communities. It's clearly mentioned. Nirvana is not the anupanna nirodha of suffering. That is focusing merely about the absence. Merely about the absence. So what we are doing here is, when that suffering is absent, nirvana is what is left. So we are going to equalize that absence with the nirvana. So we attribute all these names to nirvana, because that is the state which is left when the suffering is over.
Right. Sadhu. Yes, that's it. Now it's very clear. Thank you, Bhante. Please go ahead, Sayale Punya.
Okay, good morning, Bhante. So according to your handout, you mentioned 5 kinds of Nibbana. So this type of 5 kinds of classification, I couldn't find in the Tipitaka. I only found it like Bahana. And also another Bahana is a Pasati Bahana. You didn't mention like that. So this is based on which reference? This classification.
I will come into that in the next lecture. Now we just explain about the existence of the nirvana. The remaining 4 will come. Patipasati Pahana is Palachitta. So it falls into the condition. So it is. So actually, we all within the sasana we have 7 types of nirvana. One is Nichadiki nirvana. We will next lecture. I will give a more broad explanation. Those nirvana have been advocated in the Brahmajala Sutta. Ditta Dhamma Nibbana Vada, 5 types of nirvana. One is enjoying the sensual pleasures. One are the remaining other 4 jhanas, including the arupa. If someone considers them as the cessation or nirvana, it's a wrong view. Then the other 6, the 5 I have listed, and then according to the sevenfold nirvana, it comes as the number 6. So the remaining what I have removed is the Patipassati nirvana. Patipassati nirvana is the Phalacita. If you know the Mangala Sutta, we have Tapocha Brahmacharyancha Arya Satchana Dasana Nibbana Satyakiriyacha Etam Mangala. Here nirvana, according to the commentary, Nibbana Satyakiriya means attain the Phalacita, not attain the great nirvana. So some places Phalacita has also been referred as nirvana. It's a conditioned nirvana. Means we should not get stuck in the word nirvana. For the Phalacita, the word nirvana has been used because the kilesas become more tranquilized. Then Sammuti Nibbana, we can find in many places, not with that specific term. What is the logic behind it? We'll discuss next week. The Tadanga Nirvana, you can find the word in Anguttara Nikaya. I have given you the reference, Tadanga Nibbana. And also it can be explained based on the Salleka Sutta. And the Vikkamana Nibbana can also be found in the Navaka Nipata of Anguttara Nikaya, the word. In the commentarial explanations, we find it equalized with Pahana. And also if you go Tadanga Nibbana, Tadanga Nibbuto, we find these terms within the literature. So how do we explain them based on the Tipitaka and also practically, what is the use of such states? We'll have a more broader discussion next week, because now I have explained about the great nirvana which we aspire. So the same formula we are going to apply to the remaining 4, actually, 4 nirvanas. The 4th one is also equal. It's the indication of kilesas. I'll be explaining on all these 4 in the next lecture, because I have made the approach to the unconditioned state. The same approach will be made to explain the remaining 4 states. You cannot find the list in one place in the Tipitaka.
Okay, thank you so much, Bhante. And also today, you made one point is very clear. Is something if we consider the living being, so we have to consider the living being in the past and the future. If we talk in that sense, but as I heard many teachers when they explain those points, sometimes they mix with Paramattha Dhammas, so it made the listeners confused.
Yeah, actually. So in some places, people ask the question. We mix Paramattha and Panyati and explain. Then it can make a huge confusion. So if we make the Panyati approach, past, present, and future, all reality should be considered as the being. Then the cessation of that suffering is the nirvana, and it also belongs to the being. If we make a conventional approach, then if we make an ultimate approach, there's no being to be discussed. So then what happens? In that regard, there's no one who has attained the liberation. It's just the cessation of the suffering of the non-arisen reality, Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Bhante. This point is very important. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Okay, thank you, Bhante. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Please go ahead. I think it's Sayale Piyadasi.
Good morning, Bhante.
Morning, Sarah.
Bhante, as I listened to the lecture, a simile came to my mind. And I just want to ask if it's a valid simile or not. How would Bhante think? So if we compare the whole existence to an ocean, and we would say when the ocean is like, when the wind blows and the ocean becomes wavy, so there are waves on the ocean. Okay, no wind, the ocean is completely still. So here in that simile, how it occurs to me, the wind, karma and avidya, and the completely still ocean, nibbana, and the waves on the ocean are namarupa. Would that be a valid simile?
It would be a valid simile if we can, my personal view is, if we can clearly distinguish that the still water and the waves are completely two states. If otherwise, if someone, would it lead to an idea that the samsara came from nirvana? Because if the nirvana is the still state, the same water, and same water had become waves. So does it lead to the idea that the samsara is based on nirvana? If we can avoid this confusion, yes, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand when, many teachers speak about inseparability of the two.
Yeah.
Not that one conditions other. Well, let's say there is a wind, yeah, karma and avidya, right? And that is blowing all the time. We don't know how long. We cannot say how long it's blowing, but we can stop the wind.
For example, this is the ocean. So the wind is blowing, right? Because of the wind, we have the waves, right? So if the wind was cut off from here, then the ocean becomes still, right? This is the simile, okay? Right? So this is the nama and rupa, right? This is nirvana. Okay, so this is nama and rupa, right? So now the only the concern that I have about this, only concern that I have, otherwise I would fully agree with this. Is it saying that nirvana existed at this moment even, and nama rupa sprung from nirvana? Did you get my point? Like the concern that I have.
Yeah, I see.
The same water. So if, like, the only thing is, if someone can argue this nirvana is the water, same water that has come into the waves. So if we talk about the wave function, like it's not, we are not talking about the water, we are talking about the waves. Yeah, then that makes sense to me, because waves is other than something other than the water. But can this lead, only concern that I have is, can it lead to the idea that nirvana, samsara came forth from nirvana?
Yeah, I see, Bhante, I see. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for insights. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Bhante. Sadhu. I don't see any more questions here, Bhante. So I don't know if we should wait for a little bit or we can call it for today, Bhante.
Just wait for one few minutes because I took some time today.
Oh, okay, Bhante. So yes, everyone, if you have any questions, please raise your hand, or you can put your question in the chat box and we can read it out for you.
I didn't know, right?
No, Bhante. Oh, yeah, sorry, Mr. Ananda. Please go ahead, Mr. Ananda.
Okay, thank you. Bhante actually asked us no questions also. I mean, so earlier when you were talking about the beginning of samsara, actually, Bhante, I mean, it is very, very clear, isn't it, that, you can't have a beginning, because, so when you believe in Hetupala, so for everything there should be a reason. So then, it could be a big bang or whatever in the, present day, things. So for that also we have to have a reason, something has to come together. So is it really necessary to talk about, beginning of a samsara? I mean, isn't it very, very apparent that there is no beginning or end?
Yeah, when we have that approach as a Buddhist, yes, it's very apparent that it cannot have a beginning. You are correct. I will agree with you 100%. But the thing is, why people are searching for a beginning? Because why do we say it's conditioned? Because we have the very basic of the conditionality, conditioned theory. The theory of conditionality, very basic, is based on nama and rupa. We are talking about nama and rupa. It arises and pass away. They have a momentary existence. So before they suddenly pop up and vanishes. So there should be causes for that. So likewise, we see a stream of nama and rupa. But if someone doesn't have this understanding or doesn't have this view about Nama and Rupa, I think they will have problems in accepting this theory, because for us, every chitta has a beginning and passing away. So therefore, we need similar causes for this existence. But if someone doesn't have this Nama Rupa Paricheda idea, Nama and Rupa, I think there can be some difficulties in some beings to understand that there should not be a beginning. I think that is based on this because we are talking about Nama and Rupa, based on Nama and Rupa. If someone doesn't have that idea, maybe I cannot give an answer for how others think, because I am it's very clear that many people are searching for a beginning.
Okay. Even otherwise, Bhante, like for example, if you just take only material things like, Big Bang, for example. So Big Bang to happen now, so there should be other conditions I have to satisfy. Right?
That's true. So some scientists are suggesting there were another big bangs before that, information and contraction, and this is just one part of it. Yeah, it's
yeah. Okay, yes, thank you.
So we'll call it a day then.
Okay, thank you, Bhante. Yes, sadhu.
May this merit help us to attain the ultimate liberation and also support the prolongation of the Buddha's teaching. Buddha sasanam chiram tittatu, Buddha sasanam chiram tittatu, Buddha sasanam chiram tittatu, sadhu sadhu sadhu.